My name is Ravi Tharisayi. I'm part of the solutions team here at New Relic. And we wanted to start things off in this track talking about a topic that we hear from a lot of our customers in this subject around transformation. And it's really around measurement. And we hear from a lot of customers, a lot of you who are embarking on transformational efforts, things like DevOps, but also incorporating new transformational technologies. And the question we consistently get is, what should we measure? What are the KPIs that matter? How should we be thinking about our measurement strategy? You are working with so many customers in a lot of different industry. What are some of the best practices that you've picked up from working with so many customers across these different industries? And so I'd like to start things off by sharing some of those learnings, some of those practices that we've developed, and then we'll also hear, as I mentioned, from Jonathan Love, who's a senior SRE at GE Digital, and hear about some of the practices that they deliver in their real-world example. First, just a reminder on our safe harbor statement, on any forward-looking statements. This topic of measurement, it's actually something that's really personal for me. I started my career as a software engineer at a systems integrator, working for a lot of different clients and a lot of different industry, and it was a lot of fun that way in the sense of working on so many different projects. There was one project in particular that was particularly interesting. We were working for a medical device manufacturer, and at that time, all of our projects were developed using the waterfall method. And so we spent one full month of just requirements gathering. We spent another month of just designing the system that we were going to build. And finally, we started getting into development. And so each of the developers were in their development environments, building and coding. And we finally got to a point, we're probably halfway through our budget, to the point where we can actually see the thing that we actually are building. So I remember this vividly, sitting around our team lead's desk as he completed that final build, spun up the application, hit the URL, and then this happened. The page was loading. And it was loading for 10 seconds. And it was loading for 20 seconds. 30 seconds went by. And finally, the top banner appeared and the rest of the page was still loading. We knew that things were off track. And the thing that we had spent so much time designing and thinking through wasn't really working. And we continued to muddle along. After that, we even got it to production. And soon, our end customers were seeing this problem. Our end users were frustrated. Our client was pissed. We knew we needed to do something drastic, so we abandoned everything that we'd been doing. We adopted agile methodology aggressively. We moved to daily stand-ups. We really refined our code pipeline. We got to a point where we were delivering 1 to 2 deploys to production every day. And in spite of all of that transformation, and really a transformation that most organizations dream about, we never really could solve this problem. We never really could get that spinning circle to get to a reasonable amount of time. And for me, when I think back to that time, even in spite of that incredible effort that we made in transforming to agile methodologies, none of that is worth it unless you can direct that velocity and that agility to a measurable problem and solve something in a measurable way that your end customers can see and that your stakeholders can see. Without that measurable impact, all of that transformation is really useless. I'm like probably many of you, I go to conferences, I hear a lot of talks on culture, I hear a lot of talks on automation. Don't really hear as many talks on measurement, which when you think about it is really crazy, because how will you know the thing that you're doing is actually worth it? How will you know that it's actually impacting the stakeholders that you care about? When we work with customers, we, as I mentioned, hear a lot of problems, a lot of challenges around measurement, and these usually fall into two big areas. One is just the disparate data sources that different teams are using. There's a lot of stakeholders involved. They're looking at different metrics. Those metrics are coming from different data sources, and it's hard to stay aligned when you've got such a cross-function of teams that are trying to get aligned around what's happening. The second problem is just how complex modern systems are. There's more layers than ever. There's more dependencies than ever. It's more dynamic than ever. And it's hard to know what's happening in a system like that when it's that complex. A lot of you are here because you believe in what New Relic delivers. We integrate all of these measurements into one cloud platform. It's delivered real time to our 17,000 customers. And really, there's a lot of power in the measurement that we can deliver through our platform. But we still get a lot of questions around how to get started. How should we be thinking about the right measurements for what we're trying to do? And so, based on our learnings from working with all of you and customers from a number of different industries, we think of 5 dimensions for measurement. And these range in things from engineering velocity to service quality, up through business success, down through application infrastructure performance. Let's go through these 5 and talk about the key questions that you're trying to answer across these 5. Some of the metrics that you can think about as you're thinking about measuring in these different dimensions, and then a sample dashboard that might show you how you could use it and the different types of stakeholders that might look at that information. So one of the most basic questions that you all are trying to answer is just that basic thing is my site up or down? And this really gets at a dimension around service quality. Is it up? Can customers hit the URL? Is it working? Is it available? And so the metrics in this area are going to be things like availability, and you might set an SLA against that availability. But it also might have to do with things around errors, like application errors, mobile crash rates. And so the basic thing you're going to do here is set up a synthetic check. And if you're fortunate, you'll be able to look at availability in aggregate, but also look at and facet that availability down to where you are missing that availability by some key attribute or key facet that helps you focus your effort on how you can improve your availability and reliability in this important dimension. But ultimately, availability is not the end-all and be-all. If you think back to that page load problem, it's available, but is it working? Is it meeting the customer's expectation? And especially as concepts like SRE and other concepts have really garnered a lot more interest, this concept of is the application actually meeting the customer's expectation for what the performance should be is an important question to answer. And so as you think through this dimension, the kinds of metrics that you're going to be thinking about are things like page load time, but also time to interactive. And you might also be thinking about service-specific metrics like cart abandonment rate if you're in an e-commerce business. A dashboard in this area that you might be looking at, and this might be looked at by a number of different stakeholders that are concerned with customer experience, from customer care to marketing to the actual development team, might be looking at a dashboard like this that has metrics around things like revenue-affected errors, the number of errors, the conversion funnel, and of course, perhaps duration times. But in this particular example, this team is noticing that even though average duration is fairly stable, there's been a big spike in terms of the max duration. And so even though average duration is fairly stable, there's an important cohort of customers that are experiencing very large spikes in duration. And now this team has a common understanding of a potential problem and can start to focus their efforts on resolving that problem. Even as you're thinking about customer experience in terms of what the customer is experiencing, you have to think of the back-end systems that are supporting that. And certainly there's going to be variations in the types of traffic that you're getting. And you always want to know whether or not your system is handling that scale, handling the requests that your customers are putting on that system. And so in this dimension, the kinds of metrics that you might be looking at, of course, things like application response time, but also down to the infrastructure layer like host utilization, and increasingly things like third-party response times, as well as if you're using cloud services, the performance of those cloud services is also increasingly important. And so as a result, you might have your developer and your operations teams looking at a dashboard that might look like this, with a range of metrics across things like Kubernetes and errors by different pods, also down to CPU utilization. And in this particular case, this team might be noticing that there seems to be a pretty high correlation of database latency and the response time spikes that are happening. And now they have a way to get aligned on where to focus their efforts as they look to improve reliability in the backend systems. One of the core promises of DevOps, and really one of the key objectives that we're all trying to achieve, is that velocity. And in spite of the challenges around stability as you seek to go faster, you really want to make sure that you're gathering metrics that let you know you're making progress against that key objective. And one of the key metrics that you'll want to understand if you have confidence to continue to increase that velocity are going to be things like MTTR, to know that you can fail fast and recover quickly from potential issues, but then also looking at your lead time to making changes and your deployment success rate as you're seeking to improve that velocity. And so in this dimension, you might be looking at a dashboard that looks like this. And this might be powering your daily stand-ups, your daily routine, looking to see whether or not you're making enough builds, how those unit tests are going, the number of source code commits. In this particular example, this team might be looking and seeing the fact that there's a really high correlation between source code commits and the alerts that are being sent in production. And so that correlation might cause these teams to look at and understand whether that code pipeline has set up enough QA checks to ensure that what's getting put into production is actually of high quality and not unintentionally setting off alerts in production, creating downstream issues. The last dimension is perhaps most important, and we heard a little bit about it during this morning's keynote from our customer at Gannett. And it's this concept of, even as all these different teams are working on different parts of this application, this business, if we can go to the next slide, ultimately we need to know that all of these efforts are adding up to business success. Because it doesn't matter if we're going faster, it doesn't matter if database latency is fast, ultimately it has to end up in improving the business, improving business results. And so the common metrics that we might look at here are going to be things like revenue, but also things like order value if you're an e-commerce business, product mix. And this could really vary based on the industry that you're in. We heard from Gannett this morning about how in the media business, ad impressions are an important dimension that they're going to be looking at. If you're in e-commerce, then daily revenue might be important. You'll have to think about what's important for your business, but it's important that all these stakeholders have a common view, a common metric, into understanding whether or not their collective efforts are actually impacting the business. Because all of this is great, but if it can't impact the bottom line, then really, again, what's the point of it? So these are 5 dimensions that you can think about and hopefully inspire you to think in a comprehensive way, whether or not you're transforming around DevOps, or even if you're thinking about Kubernetes, adopting the cloud, any transformational effort that you're looking at, measurement is really the key to ensuring that all of your stakeholders are bought in and getting value from that transformational effort, especially the practitioners that are involved in the work. With a lot of these things, it requires a really high buy-in from all of those different stakeholders. And if you have the right metrics, hopefully you can get all of those different stakeholders buying into what's happening. So that's based on some of our best practices, working with different customers. Let's hear about how this works in a real-world example. I'd like to welcome one of our customers. Jonathan Love is a senior SRE at GE Digital, and he's going to talk about some of their learnings from applying these measurement practices at GE Digital. Please welcome John Love.
Thanks. Perfect. Thanks. All right. As Ravi had mentioned, my name is Jonathan Love. I'm a senior site reliability engineer at GE Digital. And on my team, here, I'll go to this side. On our team, we're sized at about 30 engineers. We've got developers, operations folks, and we adhere closely to agile methodologies, 2-week sprint cycles, follow Kanban. Our scope for monitoring includes all forms of IT monitoring across all of the business units, all of the systems. So everything from hardware failures of servers, storage, networking, all the way to detecting front-end performance degradation on GE's various websites. A couple characteristics that are unique to GE are the size and the complexity in which we operate. So for example, we've got within our New Relic environment over 15,000 APM agents deployed today, over 11,000 infrastructure agents as well. Spans over 300 accounts. So managing this can be very tricky. So to do that, we utilize large dashboards that give us insights in real time into what's going on within our New Relic environment. And using these dashboards, we're able to answer questions like, how many monitors do we have for a given application? How many monitors do we have for a given business, a given account, a given team? These are kind of simple questions, but without dashboards, we'd have to kind of go in and pull custom reports, and that'd be pretty tricky. Now, before I dive in, I wanted to mention a quote that I feel is particularly apt when we're talking about measurements relating to monitoring. Some of you may already know of her, Sheryl Sandberg, COO of Facebook, and she says, "We cannot change what we are not aware of. And once we are aware, we cannot help but change." So bearing these words in mind, people, when approaching a monitoring strategy at their organization, they'll ask a variety of questions. Questions like, what should we monitor? What should we measure? How often should we measure these things? A big one, where are our areas of greatest risk? And how do we start? Where should we focus? Where do we go next? To answer these questions, I'm just going to mention a couple terms that have kind of been helpful for us. And the first of which I'll mention is SLI. So for a given system, application, service, you need to identify what is the metric, the SLI, or the service level indicator that is indicative of the application's performance. The other term, SLO, service level objective, what's the goal for the performance? So typically people will misconstrue SLA with SLO, and they'll say, we got a 99% SLA. Well, really they're talking about the SLO. It's the goal of performance for your application. Another term that comes from the quality improvement space and applies to just systems in general is FMEA. It stands for Failure Modes Effects Analysis. And what that is it's an exercise you can do. It's just a risk assessment where you look at all the ways in which your system can fail and rank all those failure methods by probability of occurrence and severity. So if it can fail, if there's a high likelihood that it can fail in a certain way and it's very impactful, then that's a high-risk action item that should be addressed and prioritized sooner than other failure methods. So we've actually performed an FMEA against some of our critical most systems, and it gave the team that we performed it with, it gave them a good list, a starting point of where to start improving their system, improving the reliability and the uptime as well. A common challenge that we've seen when interfacing with various teams within an organization on a monitoring front is perspective. So not everybody has the same perspective and not everybody has the same interests when it relates to measurements and monitoring. For example, how many of you have direct access into the back end of the systems that you manage? All right. Conversely, how many of you are probably operating at the business layer? You don't have access to any systems directly, but you are accountable for the uptime, the availability of those systems, for revenue purposes or whatever, right? Totally different set of people. Each of these personas has different interests on data points they want to see, be it directly from their monitors or the dashboards that aggregates all that data. Showing you some real-world examples we use within GE. This was a production system. I won't name which one. You can probably figure it out if you know what the queries relate to. But basically, we were able to identify after a production code change performance degradation stemming from a MySQL query. Drilling in through New Relic APM, we could actually see the quantification of this where the response time quadrupled for a single query. After raising awareness with the application team that was responsible for this, they reverted the change. You see the performance kind of went back to the baseline. But then after their attention had been brought to this specific data point, they were then able to rely on this to track additional improvements they had made to their environment. And so when they originally started with an average response time of about 24 milliseconds, they were able to drop that to something around almost 12 milliseconds. So it was, in a very short period of time, a significant performance improvement across a system that's used all over GE. Another low-level data point that's a good example is we had a small cluster of systems. Each of the hosts has a JVM running, runs a Java-based web app. And we saw that the response time for this host was really high, like extremely high. Making this information available to the app team, within 1 week's time, they were able to add an additional host into this cluster. It dropped the response time and resulted in an almost twofold performance improvement. With additional performance tuning, they were able to see an almost six-fold performance improvement overall. And that's in a very, very short window of time. And it was just something that they could use very easily, and it was very apparent. A medium-level example, and unfortunately I've had to kind of cover the names of the environments, but this is a dashboard we use. It's a team of teams, so it's a large distributed system composed of smaller subsystems. And each of those has been categorized on this dashboard. And so what you can do is filter by the environment that your specific sub-team is responsible for and identify if you've got outstanding alerts for your particular environment. Or as the manager of this, you can see the whole service set in entirety and kind of drill down to see who's the kind of culprit and who you need to work with for that day to improve your system. This particular system, the main point here is the availability and the error percentage over time. We use this dashboard. It's actually not even used directly by the application team who manages this. It's used instead in our Digital Operations Center, our doc, where in the event that there's any kind of network disruptions, we can kind of reference back to this and see, did it impact this system? So this is like single sign-on, like login, it's distributed, and so maybe there's a network disruption in one area of the country. If we see that the error percentage over time rises, we can proactively notify the team and say, hey, we saw that this was correlated to some network events going on. And it's an example where the direct owners of the system aren't even the ones monitoring this. It's a whole nother team altogether. So within GE, we've got various business units: aviation, power. In this case, it's healthcare. Healthcare, we did an interesting exercise where they wanted us to monitor their 25 most critical applications for their business unit. So rather than going through the exercise of a lot of meetings, kind of debating, what should the SLI be, what should the SLO be for a given app, instead what we did was we just instrumented all of the applications and began generating alerts. And originally it was a very kind of noisy experience. We kind of had general thresholds defined. But over time, we began pulling month-over-month reports that would basically show, okay, these were the noisiest applications. You give that information back to your app teams, and the app teams would then refine their application or work with us to refine the thresholds used for their alerting. The outcome is that the signal-to-noise ratio for all of your apps across the business goes up. And the systems, each of the app teams, each of their applications, their resilience also goes up as well. The last example of a high-level dashboard that is not really of interest to a developer or engineer, this is something that we use personally for the monitoring team. Is we like to be able to see which businesses within GE, which groups are using what footprint of monitoring within New Relic. So we can quickly make decisions on, okay, this division is using APM more so than synthetics. Why is that? And kind of maybe there's some gaps there that we could address. So it's just an example of these are data points that aren't necessarily valuable to somebody that works directly on systems. So it's very important to consider that not every dashboard is the same, and not everybody's interests and considerations as a stakeholder in monitoring, they're not all the same either. So you want to make sure that you're giving people the right measurements given what their concerns are. So that's it. Ravi?
John, really interesting talk. I wanted to actually just, we've got a couple of minutes and dive a little deeper on that concept of perspectives, because I think yesterday you were mentioning some of the challenges around different teams sort of imposing their view on what metrics different teams should be looking at. Can you share a little bit of the challenges of trying to get alignment around those different stakeholders around the metrics that they should be looking at?
Yeah, so a common occurrence that's happened at GE in the past, and we're a lot better about it now, is quite often, an executive will ask for a series of monitors or dashboards for, all of the systems in their org, and they'll ask, say, give me a dashboard that can be used by the app team and to better manage their systems. Well, we'll give them an executive level dashboard, but the app team can't utilize that, and so that can cause issues where we're going through the effort and the cycles of developing this, and it doesn't offer the value that it was intended to offer. So it's good to clarify, up front, who is going to be using it, and what is their intention behind it, and making sure that the team using it as well understands the data that's there. So that's a big one.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, and
Cool.
thanks, John.
Yeah. Thanks.